and earns dividends for its citizens. This is clearly understood and accepted by most companies around the world. Governments, whether in advanced or emerging economies, are seized of the imperative to push innovation to enable policies, resources, and infrastructure support. However, as they say, the devil lies in the details. How can one implement models and develop ecosystems and framework conditions that actually bring stakeholders together, create synergistic relationships, build on strengths, fast track the time to market, and thereby create huge value and economic prosperity for the society at large? This is the core of the discussion we will be having over the next 15 minutes, and I'm delighted that I have with me a panel of illuminaries who cover the entire spectrum from research to implementation of innovation. So without much ado, let me quickly and very briefly introduce our experts, because they all have CVs that are very long and have achieved many distinctions, but I will focus on the key facets of their biodata, which is relevant to the discussion today. I would first like to start with one of our we were just having a discussion before this, and we realized that we are here a small group of Bangaloreans, and we are also here with somebody from the US. So I would like to first start with Mr. Nishchit Acharya, CEO, Equal Innovation and Senior Fellow, Center of American Progress. Mr. Acharya leads the Equal Innovation, an organization that collaborates with leading universities, government, foundation, and companies to assist them to integrate innovation and entrepreneurship with their impact-focused strategies. He's a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress, a contributor to Forbes, and the author of the India-US Partnership, 1 trillion by 2030 by Oxford University Press. He previously served as Director of Innovation and Entrepreneurship and Senior Advisor to the Secretary of Commerce for the Obama administration, and as the Executive Director of the Deshpande Foundation, a prominent American philanthropy on innovation entrepreneurship, and also served in the administration of President Bill Clinton. He has been quoted predominantly in the New York Times, Economist, Newsweek, Economic Times, etc. A very warm welcome to you, Nishchit, and I'm delighted that you are with us today. Mr. René von Berkel, UNIDO representative, needs no introduction in India. René, we've been on many panels together. Pleasure to see you again. He's the UNIDO representative and heads the regional office of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO in India, which is directly responsible for India, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. It works to foster inclusive and sustainable industrialization in its member countries. René has 30 years professional experience in resource efficiency, cleaner production, industrial productivity, and sustainability, with extensive international experience in Europe, Australia, and Asia. He's a Dutch national with a PhD in environmental science from the University of Amsterdam. Welcome, René. I now come to Professor Rishi Kesha Krishnan, Director and Professor of Strategy, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, one of the premier institutes of India, in fact, considered the numero uno in strategy and management. He has been a director of IIMB Indore for 5 years, a very decorated professor. He held the Jamuna Raghavan Chair in Entrepreneurship at IIMB from 2007 to 10. He was educated at IIT Kanpur, Stanford University, and IIM Ahmedabad, and has been listed in the Thinkers 50 India list of most influential management thinkers from India. Apart from several publications in academic journals, case studies, and articles written in the business press, he has written 2 books, 8 Steps of Innovation, Going from Jugaad to Excellence, which I found fantastic when I read it the first time, and I really appreciate a lot of information that he has provided in that book. I totally recommend it. It also won the Best Book Award for 2013 to 14 from the Indian Society for Training and Development, and his second book, From Jugaad to Systemic Innovation, The Challenge for India. He's a distinguished member of several working groups and boards, co-founded one startup, and the CEO for another. There cannot be a better person on this panel. Welcome, Rishi. Dr. Dietmar Hüglin, head BASF Innovation Campus. As you know, Switzerland has the pole position in innovation. Dietmar is director of BASF's BASF Innovation Campus Mumbai and Vice President for Advanced Materials and Systems Research. He is my colleague on the S&T Innovation Council for FICCI. He holds a diploma in chemistry and PhD in natural sciences, both from University of Freiburg in Breisgau, very beautiful city in Germany. In his 30 years of research career, he has held several senior management positions in Germany and Switzerland, which include global R&D head of segment home and personal care in Grenzach, Germany, and head of BASF's Research Center Basel, Switzerland. I'm delighted to have you here. Dietmar is a key author of 45 US patents and numerous written and oral papers, and he has received the Sandmeyer Award from the Swiss Chemical Society 2004, the BASF Innovation Award, and the BASF Business Excellence Award. So, gentlemen, it's such a pleasure to have you here, all of you. I would like to begin by asking you a few questions, but I think since the subject is so broad, innovation ecosystems, maybe we can start by looking at what each of you think innovation means to you. I'd like to start with Mr. Acharya.
Thank you so much, Nandini. Really quickly, I think innovation for me, a product or service that has a tangible change in how a consumer or government or society uses that. And so I think when we think about innovation, we have to think about transformation all the way to artificial intelligence and emerging, and take a very broad-based view of innovation transforms how we do things in society.
Right. Dietmar, would you like to add to what you think about innovation from your perspective?
Dietmar, you're on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute.
I have two different buttons. Yeah, thank you for this question. What I think is, innovation is really key, and a lot of people don't understand this in these times. Key not only to solve the problems of the future, but also for the wealth of the nations. There is really the clear thing, in my small country, Switzerland is a perfect example. I come back to this. And what is also important is to see it holistically. We very often have controversy with what is basic innovation, the importance, and applied innovation. To say it very clearly, we need fundamental innovation for our future. And this must be done by academia, because industry cannot do this. But we also need translational, applied innovation. And there's not a good or bad or important or unimportant. We need to see in future more innovation holistically. And the last point is, while also my company years ago did all innovation inside, of course, the future is innovation networks, innovation ecosystems, a lot of parties, a lot of different disciplines. This will be the important thing, exchange in the future more and more.
Thank you.
But it's a mindset question. Yeah, it's a mindset question, and also a risk-taking. Maybe this is also important to understand, that if we do new things, we also fail many times. This is natural. And I sometimes have discussions with people who don't want to fail. Then you cannot be an innovator. It's not possible, This is also important. Education, yeah.
True. Rishi, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, so my concept of innovation is quite simple. It's applying new ideas to solve problems, to create value.
Totally, yeah. Rene, your point of view, please?
Yeah, I think that innovation is very diverse. Am I audible now? Yes?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I think that innovation is above all very diverse. So no single approach works in all contexts. So we can talk about an AI-informed platform to advise farmers on when to irrigate, or we can talk about an alternative to a 100-year-old process to make aluminum. I get a lot of echo. I think that there's too many mics open. maybe for the other panelists to switch off. Yes,
Yeah,
I think
that would be
that
good.
works better.
Person who's not
That's a
talking.
better. Yes, so I was saying that in that sense, UNIDO likes to really work on the concept of innovations in terms of technology, in terms of products, and then in terms of business models. So technology would be battery energy storage. The product would then be the e-vehicle, and the business model would be how we then deliver a service infrastructure so that money can flow, so that the innovation can actually materialize. And that I think is comes back to what Dietmar was also saying, that we need these innovations at different levels to be synergistic and to be complementary in a network approach. Thank you.
Yeah, Rene, I'd like to stay with you there because, we are talking ecosystems here, and UNIDO has immense experience and expertise in promoting innovation clusters around the world. You are at a cusp in India where you're seeing a developing trend in India towards this concept. Although we do have a few clusters in India, largely they are either geographical or they are, real estate propositions. How do you think UNIDO can help India in this process, and where do you see a role for UNIDO here?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that the cluster concept is attractive in the sense that it focuses on local economic development. So that's the traditional interpretation of clusters, to bring small farmers for small producers together so that they can unite and work on market and productivity issues and product development. And that is very valuable. But it is not so immediately applicable for innovations. I think for innovations, really the issue is to bring the right mix of partners together. So it's not necessarily on the regional level or local level, but we need to basically bring the triple helix together, what everybody is talking about. So we need to bring the industry end user in the picture. So that can be an industry, but it can also be a healthcare facility, or it can be a government, or it can be public interest grouping in there. We need to bring the knowledge-based institutions together, which is the research, the academia, but also the technical institutes and so on. And then we get also in the government in there as a normative lead and facilitator of innovators. So defines the preferred and acceptable innovation outcomes and also sets the rule of the game. And then I think that is the standard concept. But what we are increasingly seeing as UNIDO is that we also need a role for the arbitrators. So that is basically the people who are then deciding on the money flow, who are basically serving the innovation ecosystem, but they are also making decisions in that sense. So they decide where the capital is going to go, where the IP is going to go, and so on. So we need to focus on government as a facilitator, research providers, and research users. And then I think the other really important part is to bring a degree of I would say the ambition and scope to there. So, and I think Dietmar was already referring to that in his definition of innovation. So we have the kind of application-oriented innovation, which can be quite incremental, one might also say. So trying to fix problems with basically existing and adapting existing technologies. And that can be done in the traditional cluster model and maybe extending the service centers or the common facility centers. But I guess there is also a need for the more far-reaching innovation, which is more future-oriented, and that deals with where we don't yet have the opportunity or the technologies available. So there, I think there is a need for looking at collaborative research forms with a long horizon, with an 8-year horizon or so, and with a $100 million kind of time horizon, so that we can really address issues like energy storage or alternatives to certain processes, and where we then also bring the different industries which are basically competing together to develop the pre-competitive knowledge and also the different research institutes. So I think that in that process, UNIDO is playing a modest role. We don't have the huge role, but we are, as one of the examples, if I may refer to that, we are currently working with the DST, Department of Science and Technology, to try to map the innovation system for the MSME sector, for MSME clusters in India, focusing on textiles, leather, food processing, and a few other sectors, to really see what are the collaborations that are happening. And what we unfortunately see is that there is a lot of miscommunication and distrust. which is not beneficial to innovation. Thank you.
Very interesting, Rene, because I would like to pick up on 2 points that you said. One was the collaborative research framework, and the other is the mistrust. And here I would like to bring Rishi in because he has done some seminal work on innovation and strategy. In India, traditionally, science and innovation have been at, if you take fundamental science and innovation at the other end of spectrum, they've been fairly disconnected. Yeah, and there's a changing trend today. But having said that, if you were to talk about a collaborative framework and an ecosystem like Rene was talking about, Rishi, do you see this happening, or is it going to be a terrific challenge for us to get partners together in a very symbiotic relationship? What's your thought?
Well, I think India has a lot of traditional clusters, and these got formed without anyone's intervention. So you have clusters in Rajkot, in Ludhiana, you have more traditional handicrafts in places in UP and so on. Then, of course, you have more recent clusters which got formed, once again, without too much intervention, but some government support, maybe IT and software in Bangalore, pharmaceuticals in some part of Gujarat, and again in Hyderabad and so on. So we do have a history of cluster formation in India, but most of these clusters came together due to some kind of agglomeration of skills and talent which was there in that region, some traditional benefits or some traditional resources which were there. I think you're right that creating or sort of policy induced clusters are a little more difficult to form. We are seeing some sort of, if you like, raw shoots of that in some places, particularly around some of the incubators which are working closely with startups. Recently, I've been involved with a review of India's BIRAC, which is the Biotechnology Innovation Initiative. And thanks to BIRAC, there are a whole set of clusters being formed around incubators like the Venture Center in Pune, C Camp in Bangalore, and so on. So these are thanks to the funding and the institutional support and, of course, BIRAC's intervention. So, and the other kind of cluster which I see emerging is around the research parks, which are being formed around some of the educational institutions. IIT Madras has been a pioneer in this regard. And we see a lot of startups and large companies now working closely with the scientists and engineers in IIT Madras to pioneer a whole lot of products and technologies. So I think there is certainly potential, and hopefully the work which a lot of people are doing will result in more clusters like these being formed.
Yeah, very interesting, Rishi. When we talk about clusters, we all have very different perception and there are many models. I would like to just give you an example of some of the clusters in Europe, where a cluster is a very strategic instrument, where there is a cluster manager who's not necessarily a scientist. He would be a marketing person. The entire value chain is represented in the cluster, and it is usually started by the government by putting in, say, 40 to 60% of the funds, and the range of stakeholders are invited to participate. And then this cluster is actually developed and marketed, and there is a monitoring and evaluation. I'd like to ask Mr. Acharya, the advanced economies have developed such a robust model of innovation clusters, and that's why they could accelerate the innovation time curve, the TRL of 6 to 9, what we call. So are these best practices that we can also weave into the Indian context? Or do you think we should be more functional, like we like to be in India, and just let them evolve in their own, depending on the economics, and like Rishi Kesha said, the agglomeration of maybe skills or needs or whatever the push and pull in that particular sector maybe. What are your thoughts?
So, the results are that in the United States, we've spent a lot of time thinking about this issue of innovation clusters. I would say the policies have not worked. But at the same time, we need to continue to try to make them work, right? So I don't think we quite know the original Michael Porter model of clusters doesn't apply to innovation as well, but we still have to figure out how to do it. And so, in the United States, it started in the Obama administration, when I was there and others were there, we did quite a bit to expand innovation clusters and do a lot of the things that the other speakers have mentioned. Unfortunately, when you look 10 years later, 70% of the venture capital and 70% of the privately funded startups still reside in 3 cities, Boston, New York, and San Francisco, Los Angeles. So we haven't moved the needle in terms of innovation clusters. But there is one thing we've learned, and that's that the innovation clusters that are showing progress, and so there's another 5 cities that have shown growth as real innovation clusters, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, San Diego, Austin, Texas, Seattle, and they've really developed a culture of ideas that is regionally driven. And so, if you look at the investment model, venture capitalists will often look at 1,000 business plans. They'll actively look at 100. They'll get 1,000 business plans. They'll actually look at 100. They'll fund 10, and then only 1 or 2 are actually. So if you apply that lens to economic development and regional innovation and regional startups, what that means is you need a fairly robust set of idea generation engines. And that might be accelerators, it might be universities, it might be academic hospitals, which in the United States do quite a bit of the research. It'll be government labs as well. And so there's a lot of places from which ideas are generated, and then they tend to go through this pipeline where the good ones are promoted and the bad ones are weeded out. And then beyond that, the good ones, even then, only 20% of them will either create economic value or jobs. And even on the jobs numbers, we have a pretty clear number in the United States. The Small Business Administration has shown that job creation in the United States happens only in 2 types of organizations. One is the one that makes it past the first 1 or 2 years and is actually survives. They're the ones who start creating jobs on the small business sector. And then the other is large-scale job creation happens when a startup reaches about $1 billion, whether that's money they've raised from venture capitalists or it's $1 billion in sales. So these are really hard. If you're early stage, it's really hard to make it through the first year. And if you're growing and your strategy as a government is to create jobs, then reaching that billion number is extraordinarily hard. And so when we think about innovation clusters, the cities in the United States that have it, the Californias, New York, Boston, they have that, incubation of ideas at a very large scale. And then the support networks, the educated workforce, the capital, the talented executives to follow that continuum of job growth and value creation. In the other sector, in the other places where innovation clusters have worked, they've very deliberately been building the base to do the exact same thing. So if you take Pittsburgh, it was Carnegie Mellon University, University of Pittsburgh, it's Pittsburgh Medical Center. They've very deliberately built the basis for the workforce, the idea generation, and they've provided the capital through the government. And so I think when you think about context, I would agree with some of the other speakers that it has to be very locally driven with a very soft hand of guidance from the central government, where there's funding support, and where government can be an active partner, which essentially means 2 things. Government can provide grant funding and guidance as to areas where research will be supported, and so institutions can build their capacity, but also government as customer. So, the United States, the federal government spends $1 trillion, and they've mandated about 20% to go to small businesses. In India, there's the same set-asides that are there. Often these are not enforced, but government as customer is a very powerful tool to help startups and innovation, in addition to the grant funding for basic research that goes to universities. And so I think when you think about the lessons from the West, it's sort of this light hand for the central government and really helping regions with enough funding and support to get to the other side. So in other words, it doesn't take 5 years, it takes 15 to 20 years to build these ecosystems. And do you have the political will and support to support for that long and through that many failures that will come along the way? So I think that's the way, as India develops these policies, they should think about it.
I think that's a very important point, that government is not just an enabler, a funder, but a customer, because that kind of helps to scale, and that kind of helps to test, pilot, and move it around. But a couple of things that happen in a cluster also is that when large companies come in, they bring their supply chain. And that kind of, gives the entire cluster an added criteria of, including small and medium, but also your extended supply chain, like you talked about, for example, logistics providers and many others that come into play and who are very critical parts of this value chain. I'd like to ask Dietmar, when a MNC or a large company like yours looks at being part of a cluster, what are the kind of things that you look in that cluster, and how do you ensure that your supply chain is involved in it?
Yeah, good. We clearly see that our strength is to understand the market needs, and our strength is more the development side of the whole thing, the application. When we look at the cluster, the most important thing, and again, I think a colleague just said it, incremental is for us not very complicated. There we are comfortable with our technology positions. This is a little bread and butter. I'm referring to fundamental new things, new battery technologies, this type of things. There we need a cluster to support fundamental innovation, and this relates to real specific technology portfolios. What we do there is the open innovation model that we select academia, which has a very strong position in one of the attractive fields, like we have open innovation with California, with the University of California, Stanford. There we even have labs in the building. We have contracts there in Europe, of course, since many years. And maybe now coming to India, we have it also since years in Japan, South Korea, China. And I started 3 years ago also to select partners here in India who have an attractive portfolio of knowledge and also talent, of course, talent. IIT Bombay was the first, second was NCL, National Chemical Labs in Pune. And the important point there is that they should understand what our capabilities are and what we need from our point of view for our markets meeting societal needs. And we need to deeply understand their capabilities. And then maybe we come back to this later. Of course, there are in some countries, in some ecosystems, there are very, very attractive intermediates, organizations which help to get this important bridge between fundamental knowledge generation and applications, prototypes, these type of things. And your organization, Anandi, Fraunhofer is one of them, and where I'm from, Switzerland, also has this type of organization. And this is very attractive for us, for BASF, to also closely work to such enabling organizations, I would call it, like Fraunhofer or EMPA or others globally.
Yeah, that is that you have such organizations that kind of accelerate the innovation and play intermediaries. Rene also mentioned about it. But a new kid on the block in all of this are startups. They did not exist the way they did before. And in economies like India, where you do not have such an intermediary, I'd love to hear from each one of you. Could a startup probably play a role where you could accelerate research to market? And maybe I can start with Nish on this.
Yeah, I think very much so. I think in the most of the world, including India, bridge to bring new technology hired by large corporations. So there's been a lot of push towards corporate innovation, and now have what Dietmar was talking about, corporate innovation labs and structured programs. But often the easiest ways to integrate in emerging technologies is to find the startup and acquire it. So I think they will continue to play that role. And when you think about India, the corporate sector, certainly the IT services sector, even now is quite established in its work. And the old industries are quite established. They're hitting up against Clay Christensen's work around disruptive innovation, and so startups provide that window into where the disruptive innovation is, and can certainly be a bridge for those large companies that have the technology and the supply chain and the skill to implement it at large scale. So I think startups play that important role. The one thing I'll say is that in Bangalore that works, in Hyderabad that works, in Gurgaon that works, because the large companies and startups sit side by side. But what do you do with an amazing startup that's at IIT Kharagpur. How do you connect that to the corporate innovation ecosystem and the corporate sector to scale that up? The challenge we're talking about is how do we match up the talent in India that doesn't sit in the 3 or 4 cities startups and companies are, and make sure that that great research and that startup innovation is connected to the right players.
Would you agree, Renee? I think you focused, you said recently on some of these clusters where you had, leather and all these things. We don't see too many startups in those kind of subsectors of the industry. What is your take on this?
I mean, I maybe I can put a slightly different spin on this, because I sometimes I feel that if we talk about clusters, innovation clusters, we think too much about brick and mortars and institutions. And maybe institutions we already have quite a lot. I'd like to think that if we really want to push the innovation boundary, we might probably look more for consortia or so. So consortium is always a business opportunity and is always more an ad hoc collaboration in that sense. So we have a certain research question or innovation need, and then we work for 3 or 5 years on that with a group of partners. And then I think that we could also learn from some of the collaborative research which in Australia happens, in Japan, in Korea, South Korea, which is trying to bring different research providers together. So not a one-on-one, but a multiple on multiple to bring that together. And then we can say, of course, how do we get that? And that might need a kind of a mediated or facilitated marriage in that sense. So because intuitively, universities or research organizations which are in a closely matching area would not be too keen to collaborate. But if there's a funding and a large scale framework, then they can work together and they can bring the complementary skills. And then we can have a different, let's say Volkswagen, Toyota, Mahindra and Tata all work on e-batteries because they all will ultimately need that. And I think this kind of innovation or consortia maybe is more needed than the bricks and mortar. The bricks and mortar institutions are perhaps more needed for this application-based innovation, which in BASF can do on its own, but which small enterprises will need a facilitator or cluster to help with. But that is something different from the trying to push the envelope of what we know. And we, for sure, we talk about also about an age where we have some aspirations. We have aspirations in terms of sustainability, inclusiveness, zero carbon emissions. So if we want to get somewhere there, we can't just fiddle around the margin, so to speak. We have to have some big visions for which bigger consortia need to be created. I don't know whether that answers your question, but I think that is really important that we also start to think about not just where's the incubators that we can already spin off with existing research, but how do we drive research towards having the technologies available that we need in 5 or 10 years. I mean, on the innovation side, I think that UNIDO is, of course, also working with some of the startup and innovation ecosystem for the clean tech area, for example, where we have a program with BE, Bureau of Energy Efficiency, on what we call Facility for Low Carbon Technology Deployment. So we call for small startup or spin-offs from the IITs and other innovations to come forward with specific innovation. And then we try to help them to link to an industrial application. And then the industrial application, we see them as a deployment trial. We try to do some verification and validation to help them through one of the valleys of death. So what we've done, for example, is some phase change materials in chest coolers and chest freezers, or phase change materials to avoid having a refrigerator on a delivery truck. So that could be examples of more which ultimately fit in the category of application research, but it's not happening because of the lack of linkages. So an organization like UNIDO and other brokers can help in assisting to get industry partners together with the research providers. Thank you.
Yeah, that answers my question insofar as you are distinguishing between a strategic cluster and an application-oriented cluster, right? So, but in either of them, I think the supply chain spin-off startups do have a role, isn't it, Rishi? Wouldn't you think that there is still space for these kind of partners as well?
Yeah, I think the heart of the matter is that we often in all of this focus too much on the supply side and don't look enough at the demand side. We also tend to underestimate the importance of people understanding each other well, a point which Dietmar made earlier. For example, in India, I think a lot of startups work on what to me seem to be completely unimportant problems because they don't have a good understanding of the demand side. And then they wonder why their startups are not succeeding. They also, of course, want to collaborate with large companies, but the large companies often don't have the right mechanisms in place to collaborate with them. The large companies don't know exactly what they're looking for either. It's just sexy these days to collaborate with startups. So everyone wants to have a startup accelerator program, but they haven't a clue of what they're trying to do and what they hope to achieve out of that. So, I mean, yes, I think you made an important point, Anandi, that India is high on talent, but a challenge we've had for a long time is how do we really use that talent for the kind of outcomes we require. I think during COVID, we have seen some evidence that that can be made to happen if somebody can do a better job of coordinating different players together. So we've seen, for example, in the medical devices space, in the testing kit space, in the to some extent in the vaccine space, we've seen efforts by the government through some intermediaries to bring people together to get joint programs, a bit like the collaborative kind of work that Rene was talking about. And we've had collaborative programs in India earlier as well. The Principal Scientific Advisor's Office had a really good automotive collaborative program about 10, 15 years ago, where you had academia and industry working together. Startups were not so popular at that time, but a few startups did emerge out of that program. So yes, it's certainly possible, but I think the role of intermediaries, greater emphasis on the demand side, better understanding of each other's strengths and ways of working with each other, these are all important factors for all these things to work.
Yeah, totally with you on that. Dietmar, one question to you on how, given all these things, one of the key things that corporates look at is IPR, protection of their knowledge, and how to, ensure that even if it is pre-competitive research, that their foreground knowledge is protected. Can you give one example of how it works in clusters so that we have an understanding of, how to take this forward?
What you say cluster, this is for this, what I said, this strategic partnership. We select certain academia for strategic partnership, and then we have multiple point-to-point. Strategic means we want to have ease of doing business. We do not want always to negotiate on contracts, lawyers, this takes time. And I have to say that these strategic partners like Harvard University, MIT, Stanford University, ETH Zurich, Imperial College, and so forth. Here in India, IITB and NCL Pune, we have a framework, and I think this is widely accepted, and this we have to demand. This means that we have access to at least one piece of application. It can be very narrow, based on a fundamental technology. And then everything depends on if the institute has prior technology, a background IPR. Of course, this is owned by the institute. We respect this. But we want, in case of success, to have access to it for our defined application. And then, of course, we agree either on royalty payments based on success. Of course, and we fund the partnership. And internationally, in Japan, in China, everywhere, at the end of the day, with such, I would say, institutions, we always agree on mutual terms. First right of refusal, of course. If we stop things, if we change our mind, which can happen in a big company like BASF all time, we skip a market, then the partner must be able to pursue it, of course. I can tell you, sometimes it's very tedious to get it done with the lawyers. Lawyers are very complicated people, right? They do also their job. But we spend time, and then we want to have a master contract, the umbrella contract, and then we plug in the different projects. And that's one of the reasons that we do not like to work with 100 universities in a country, maybe only with 4 or 5. Because then this is very straightforward. And we have right now no issue in North America, Europe, also in Asia with this. And if a partner cannot agree to fundamental principles which we have to demand, sorry, then we have to step away. This is also not a problem. Everybody, it's free negotiation. But it's not, it was a big issue. Maybe last remark, when I was here in India, 96 or so, it was impossible. You could not agree, I tell you. You could not agree with the Indian university on any cooperation model because it was a bureaucratic monster, the whole thing. And therefore, in India, I really see a lot of progress, a lot of improvements now. Yeah.
Thank you. If it's of any consolation to you, even within Fraunhofer, where we do 7,000 projects a year, the legal department is our black box, and we really cannot do too much. And we always have to find a way where we kind of reach very close and then give them a contract that we know they will largely agree. But surprises are always in store. I'd like to come to Nish once more to talk about what, according to you, because you said you've been in Bangalore a lot, you worked with Deshpande Foundation, you've done a lot of work in the US. What is the one secret sauce for an innovation cluster that you would like to suggest for India?
I think it goes to this, what I mentioned earlier, this decentralization and building these local leadership clusters is really important. And so in India, actually, we scout technologies for various organizations. My current role with Equal Innovation, and there's actually about 300 centers for research commercialization, innovation of products, services, or entrepreneurship in universities, hospitals like AIMS, private accelerators. So there's quite a few nodes where innovation is occurring in India. The challenge is, how do you match them up with the right resources to bring that innovation to market, which again is a long struggle. And so, the places where it's working, the lessons learned are really to facilitate those local cluster developments and then support them from whether it's the corporate largest company in town. So the model of Austin, Texas was a corporate level one. It was Dell Computers has spun off hundreds of startups that have made Austin, Texas into a startup ecosystem. In other places like San Diego and Pittsburgh, it was the University of California, San Diego, it was the Carnegie Mellon University. So there's different ways to do this, but there tends to be a nodal leadership agency, whether it's government or the private sector. And then there's a significant decentralization of responsibility, but an effort to bring them together. And so I think, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the West. I think the big one is that this is a long-term process. This takes 20 years before an innovation ecosystem is really producing ideas at a rapid clip, and those ideas actually become relevant. So it's not to simply have a lot of ideas and have an innovation cluster. It's to see companies or products or services or quality of life improve at that innovation cluster. And so it's got to be a long-term time frame, and it has to have lots of people involved, lots of organizations, and lots of failure along the way. But in India, because there are these 300 entrepreneurial innovation commercialization driven centers at large institutions, there is a lot of opportunity for cluster development in all parts of the country. And it's really a matter of, where will the resources and leadership come to take this 20-year sort of journey to make the cluster a vibrant producer of value.
True, very true. What would you think is, taking from this, what would you think is a challenge that we need to really focus? One core challenge which we need to get out of the way if we need innovation clusters to succeed?
From my perspective, I think it's the government, and this is true in the United States as well, really needs to learn about these new technologies. What we saw, for example, with social media and the issues that came up over the last 5-6 years, the private sector is way out in front of government and regulators. And, it's only going to be more difficult with technologies like artificial intelligence. For clusters to work, I think the regulators, government bureaucrats and leaders at the state and national level have to really spend some time understanding what these technologies are for, and what the good and the bad is, and then figuring out how they're going to partner with organizations, with the large companies to facilitate the roadmap. So if I was to say anything is important in innovation cluster development, it's to get in front of the technologies and understand them better. Otherwise, you end up with what we're seeing with privacy. You end up with what we're seeing with some terrible things that got in front of in time, and now they've proliferated worldwide. So I think that's the most important thing: learn and then nurture from there.
Thank you. Rishi, may I come to you with the same question? What do you think could be for India, from your deep interest, the one secret sauce and the one big challenge that we are facing, which needs to be get out?
Are you referring to cluster formation, Anandi?
Yes. Innovation clusters. Because we are in the cusp where we are setting up many of those. Where do you see the challenge and a secret sauce that needs to be?
Well, I think the challenges are many. So I'm not sure I can put my finger on any one, because we don't have too many policy induced kind of clusters that have got formed in India. I think the secret sauce is probably for the government to figure out what is the role it needs to play. And if I were to put my finger on one thing, it's a point that you and I discussed a couple of days ago, Anandi. I think the government has to start making itself open to supporting research and development by private entities. By and large, in India, that's not been the case in the past. The government has given tax breaks, but a tax break is no use if you're not making any profit. So that's not a very great incentive for people who are just starting off on R&D. Biotechnology is the one domain where we have seen the government willing to provide funding directly to industry for R&D and concept development and trials and things like that. So I would imagine that the government has to get over its reluctance to get directly involved in funding private R&D. I think if they're willing to consider that, I think we could see a lot of changes happening. So, and I think there are many ways in which they could do it. And they've sort of made a start, because the government has been willing to fund startups, for example, of course, indirectly through government banks and other entities. But I think this R&D funding is the one area where I would sort of really hope for some big change to happen. The other thing which would really help is if understanding the demand side who are involved in all these clusters. Remember, you were talking about the importance of having a cluster manager who is more business oriented. I think even the academic incubators and other entities which are involved in supporting innovation, they really must invest in developing expertise in understanding demand, which means you need people who come in maybe from industry with that knowledge, who can help basically identify what are the right problems to solve. I mean, so we need greater mobility. Maybe that's what I'm looking for, better mobility between industry and academia, so that you have more of that demand side perspective coming into the academic institutions.
Totally on that, Rishi. And Dietmar, you mentioned earlier on one very, very critical element, which is mindset. I mean, you can't talk enough about this, and I don't think we had the time to go deep into this topic, although it is such a critical aspect, because if I compare the mindset in Europe, where you look at least 6 to 7 years of long-term R&D, and in India, the tendency is to look at in-licensing and quick fructification of patents. Where do you see the role of mindset, and how can we address this?
I just give an example. In my building, I think 1 year ago, I was in the gym, and there was another guy cycling close to me from the same building. And this was the first billionaire I met. Billionaire, not millionaire, billionaire. He is a non-residential Indian from London. And I talked to him. I said, I'm from Switzerland. I'm running a research site, and we do a lot of innovation and very risky things. And I asked him how he makes money. He says he buys property and he sells property. And then he told me 2 weeks ago he had a property in London, £20 million, and he sold it for 35. And then I said, yeah, but you are from India. What are you do for India, for this country? Would you not? Because I came back from Bangalore talking to startups, which they are looking for money, risk capital. This means also taking into account a portfolio of startups. You can make money with it. A lot of companies or people do it. But this risk aversion, to be sure that I have exactly revenues from what I'm doing, this is very deep entrenched in India. And I understand if you are short in money, you don't want to risk your little money. But if you have more money, the country should go more towards supporting risk-taking, I would say, in all elements, from school, because I'm here in the government body of a college. It's also out in school. It's more direction, what you have to learn, less what you think makes sense. This open thing, this will come. I'm optimistic for India. It will come. It will still take time. But you can only have large gains by taking risk. Otherwise, you play lottery, of course. With lottery, you can have large profits, but it's quite risky. So this is something which India needs to understand on all levels: government, individuals, people who have money, investors, the whole community. You cannot excel in your business also if you do not take risks in research and development. It's not possible. I cannot invent a new COVID technology not taking risks. You see it perfectly. Small company in Germany, this company from Mainz, they did fundamental research on messenger RNA, and now most likely with Pfizer they will make a multi-billion, I don't know what business. The guy is interesting. He's from Turkey. He still lives in a tiny flat, has no car. His wife, he's a passionate scientist. He will make a multi-billion business, but because he took risks. He took a lot of risks going into this new technology for new vaccination. And this will come. I'm optimistic, but it will take time. And maybe the last point, from the parents to the students at school, universities, all functions in the country need to more embrace risk-taking and not punish people who fail. If you punish somebody who fails, he will not start again risking things.
Yeah, thank you. That was really very fine placed, and we are actually almost at the end of our panel discussion. It was such a joy talking to all of you, but I'd like to, for the benefit of all of us, as well as the people who are attending this, just try to very quickly put on my finger on some of the key points that you all have mentioned. One was the role of so critical in an innovation cluster. The other is the focus on demand. So not just looking at what can I supply, but what is there that is required in the market so that you're filling a gap. A very critical aspect which all of us talked about, collaborative relationships and how to forge these relationships in such a way that there is a value add and there is a synergistic relationship in the whole framework. A very, very important point that Nishchit brought about was government as customer, not just as a facilitator and enabler or a funding mechanism, but also as a customer, so that there is scaling up and there is transfer to market that happens. Startups being such an important element in today's world, the smart use of startups and that they understand what market needs are and how to work with large companies. What are the modalities that we can put in place that large companies, Rishi said most of them don't even have a clue of how to work with startups, but I'm sure if there is a framework, it can work. Again, another aspect which Rene brought in is being less bureaucratic, the speed of working, having a flexible but robust framework where you can bring in issues like IPR and deal with them effectively. The aspect of mindset, failure, understanding, capabilities, and Rishi again mentioned the leveraging of human resource potential. Another critical element in clusters, which all of us talked about, is the long-term strategic clusters as well as the applied research element of clusters, and the role of government once again in terms of granting, giving grants to the private industry in R&D, underwriting risk, just like any other company in Europe or other parts of the world where private industry also gets grants from the government and not just the research and development organizations. Rishi mentioned mobility, which I think, unfortunately, we couldn't go into it, but I think it's a hugely important factor, because innovation always functions when you have cross-fertilization of ideas. So mobility is an extremely relevant point. And finally, the aspect of risk capital coming in from other sources like high net worth individuals. China has made a huge case of this, where you have large companies that put in $7 million, $8 million. For example, there's a metalcraft company in China which has given Fraunhofer 7 million euros to set up the biggest digital factory for metalworking in China. So these are elements that can add to an innovation cluster. I'm sure if we had more time with these experts, we could have gone into so much more detail, but I'm extremely thankful for this wonderful discussion we had. And I hope the people who are hearing this enjoyed this as well. Thank you so much for spending your time with us, and have a great day. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Anandi.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anandi. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye from Mumbai. Bye-bye.
In his current role as Managing Director of Accenture Ventures in India, Mr. Sabharwal is responsible for designing and leading the Open Innovation Program for India, including collaborating with startups, VCs, PEs, accelerators, incubators, industry bodies, as well as academia, as well as building a deal pipeline for making strategic minority investments, as well as identifying and selecting potential acquisition targets. Mr. Sabharwal is also a mentor of change for the Adal Innovation Mission, and is on the advisory board of the Israel Center of Excellence at IIM Bangalore, and also mentors multiple deep tech startups to help them scale and globalize. I'll now hand it over to Mr. Sabharwal to introduce the panelists and start the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Divya, for the kind introduction. I'd like to start by wishing all of you the best of health in these difficult times. And now I'd like to introduce my esteemed panelists. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Amitabh Bandyopadhyay, Professor, Department of Biological Sciences and Bioengineering, IIT Kanpur. He runs one of the most successful e-cells in any education institute in India. And I've been partnering with that institute as well. Second, we have a special guest, Mr. Efi Baruch, co-founder and CEO of Plethora, an Israeli startup that uses gamification to teach students foundation of computational thinking. Shalom, Efi, and welcome. Then we have Mr. Anand Sudarshan, who's the founder of Children Advisors, an education advisory firm based at Bangalore. And finally, we have Mr. Binayak Acharya, founder and CEO of ThinkZone, a World Bank awarded social enterprise which works towards improving the educational outcomes of children from low-income communities. So a fascinating panelists, and I'm really looking forward for a very exciting and insightful discussion on this very, very important topic, which has emerged, especially post the pandemic. So what I'm going to do now is to just give a few opening remarks, just to set the context and tone of the panel discussion, and then I'm going to invite my panelists on a Q&A and give their own comments. So I'm going to my comments in three areas. First is the impact of pandemic, because we cannot talk anything about this panel if we don't address that. I think it will not be wrong to say that the ongoing pandemic has impacted all of us like probably no other event in our lifetime, at least. It almost seems that the world is having a reset moment. Human behavior of almost 5 billion people have changed this year, almost instantaneously. Now, from adopting e-commerce to online learning. Now, if we go to the online learning and tech as well, so the suspension of face-to-face teaching led to a massive shift to online classes almost overnight. A report by Redseer and Omidyar Network India has mapped the growth in usage of tech users from last year to this year, both paid and free unique users in K-12 and post K-12 segment. And they have both seen an increase, with the user base doubling from 45 million to 90 million. So doubled in just 1 year. And as students' exposure to online learning increased as a result of the outbreak, it forced the education providers to rethink about their own delivery models. And while the mode of online learning seems feasible for most courses over the short term, it has become pretty clear that it will be challenging to maintain this approach in the longer run, especially for pre-KG and primary schools, vocational training courses and professional courses. It will not be wrong to say even after the coronavirus pandemic subsides and we get the vaccine and other things, the ripple effects can have a permanent impact on the education landscape, and many things will not turn to the pre-COVID normal. It will be definitely a new normal emerging. And amid what is likely to be an economic recession, we see that students and parents are questioning what types of education, especially higher education, provides the best value in today's time. So that's a little bit on the pandemic and the impact of pandemic. And now I'll come to technology, which is obviously seen as the savior and the great enabler. So during the last several months, we have witnessed the impact of technology on education sector with the proliferation of online classes. And because of that, the money has followed. So the edtech sector has cornered the bulk of startup funding this year. 14 Indian edtech startups have raised funds during the pandemic, which is probably one, if not, as I said, it's probably the highest amongst all segments. Over 700 million in funding was raised by edtech startups just in HY or the first half of 2020, and this is compared to about 150 million during the same time in 2019. So from 150 million, it has gone over 700 million. So you can see the impact of COVID and the pandemic and how it has acted like fuel to this sector. There has been a 50% increase in time spent, which has gone from 60 minutes to 90 minutes on online learning. The report also noted a 40% increase in willingness to pay and a massive 83% in paid user base. Online education offerings across class 1 to 12 are projected to grow and increase 6.3 times by 2022 to create a 1.7 billion market. And the post K-12 market is set to grow about 3.7 times to touch about 1.8 billion. So the lockdown has also spurred growth in the B2B space, where unlike earlier, schools, colleges, and tuition centers were now seen aggressively adopting tech-based solutions. So not only has it boosted the B2C market, but it has also boosted the B2B market. So as you can see, and then now we see some significant amount of acquisitions as well happening in this space. So while there are not too many segments and industries which we can confidently say that they have come out stronger or either during the pandemic or post the pandemic, edtech is definitely one of them, obviously along with health tech, and the numbers are speaking for themselves. So, so this is all good, but not everything is hunky dory, right? So while technology was expected to help in delivering better and more inclusive education to a wider population in India, what has happened, unfortunately, is that the reality which is coming out is quite different. And a recent study conducted by Azim Premji University across 5 states has revealed that around 60% of the students did not have access to online education. And this is actually keeping them out of this entire opportunity, which is obviously highly unfortunate. And majority of the teachers and parents found that online mode of education is inadequate and ineffective. So with this as setting the tone, I would now like to get into the panel discussion and invite my panelists to talk about it. So let me start with a little very interesting but provocative statement which I recently came across in a panel discussion some time back, which said that Indian education is still based on 19th century being taught by 20th century teachers to the 21st century students. So I'd like to ask my panelists, do you think there is some truth in these statements or things have changed over time? And Effie, I would like you to weigh in about situation in Israel as well later once we have the other panelists talk about it. So Professor Bandyopadhyay, I'd like to start with you because you are probably closely educated, associated with this statement. So what do you think about this statement and what's your view?
Well, taking the quote almost too literally, I wish we were being taught by 19th century teachers. First, let me be a little blunt here that pre-liberalization of economy, okay, almost everybody in India was poor. You knew that those 2 houses in the whole town who owned a cars and things like that. So teaching was just as poor a profession as any, but there was a lot of prestige associated with it. Like I was taught by teachers who were really knowledgeable people, and parents kids to become school teachers. That was one of the professions to aspire for. Today, if you think within your heart, and you will realize that not you, not me, or anyone we know of encourages his or her kid to become a school teacher. And as a result, the school teaching has become like a job of the last resort. And that has had its impact. That is my personal observation. And now I am a parent of a young kid who is being taught in the school. So that is one aspect. The other aspect that again, because you provoked, so the objective of education in the country has always been, and more so now than ever, is to get a job. Okay, so you will often see that the curriculum course that someone is enrolling into and the job that someone is eventually performing, there isn't really a very tight correlation between the two. So that would, that may, provoke one to think that should we really redefine the objectives of education and realign which kid should be taught how, and maybe it will also resolve. I am in an IIT. I teach in an IIT, which is one of the insanely competitive place to get into, and we all know the good and bad effects of it. But if there is a realignment of what is to be taught and what is the end goal of that teaching, maybe that insanity can go down to some extent. These are just some of the opening thoughts that I laid on the table, and I will come to it later when I get the opportunity, that how I feel that this edtech revolution will, of course, there is this problem of access to digital education, but eventually it may democratize education in a very, very big way. But we will come to that a little later, if it is okay.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your candid remarks. So, Anand, what do you think about this statement, and how much of truth?
I think there is a fair amount of truth. I will just add to the statement to start with, actually. It's not just 19th century content, 20th century teaching, not teachers. I would say 20th century teaching, 21st century learner, but 18th century mindset and regulation, right? And I think that's important for us to remember. And to my mind, and that was the case till I've seen the new national education policy. I think there is a fundamental departure from the past, and I'm actually feeling very good about NEP. Particularly if any of you takes the trouble of reading the NEP draft document, which is a 550-page document, which is far better, sets the context far better than the final NEP 65-page document. You realize that there is a massive effort that's been made to actually look at this change. And there is therefore, while it's a very provocative statement that you have made, Avnish, you have made a correct statement, right? I wish to just add on to what Professor said and then bring what I believe is a significant differentiation today. He spoke about the fact that teaching was a highly respected, aspired profession. People aspired to be a teacher because of the regard, the respect, credibility, and the status that it brought them in wherever they were. And to whatever is the situation today, where perhaps, with the exception of maybe 10-15% of the teachers, for the rest of them, it's perhaps the last resort of a job. And therefore, there is a continuous and a decay and a decline that has happened as far as particularly school education, but the same thing is true for higher education as well. And I think the reason is because our thinking has always started off with teaching. I think what we have to do is to spin it and start thinking from a learning perspective. So instead of saying teaching learning, I always say learning teaching. To me, learning has to be put first. And the reason is because education has been viewed as a public good. And I'll just add to your provocative statement. I think it's time to stop doing that and then start making a statement that learning has to be viewed as an individual good. And when that happens, what the professor talked about, which is therefore, education, which becomes customized in some sense. I'm using a very generic term, for each student becomes a reality because everybody will start looking at from a learner's perspective. And when you look at from learner's perspective, everything changes. And the role of the teacher becomes different. Technology can play a spectacular role in making this change happen. And I will speak more about it as we go down the line.
Thank you very much, Anand. I think totally agree with you. And as we go, into the digital world, obviously we all need to become lifelong learners as well. So I think your comments from that perspective are totally, valid. And I think the national education policy, as always, the real proof will be in execution. But we will discuss about that later as we go ahead. And I'm sure people have some strong views on that. But with that, Vinayak, what do you think about this statement? And do you agree, don't agree, or what are your views?
Avnish, in a case everyone mentioned about the problems, and in a way it is also correct in some way when you made this statement. But here I would like to point that when we are looking at education as a whole, there are multiple stakeholders involved. So if we want to, have teach 21st century students in a 21st century, you can say content, to actually implement that would involve convincing all the stakeholders. And here the stakeholders are, the bureaucracy, the teachers, parents, and maybe, implementing the same. So in a way, yes, your statement is correct. that we could do a lot in terms of making sure that the children of today are getting access to content and learning of today's world. And in fact, when we say that nothing is being happening, then also I won't be agreeing the same, because there's so much things happening on ground, and especially which is being done by multiple state governments by partnering with so many other organizations. So the thing is that when some sort of innovation is happening on ground, there are too many stakeholders, and I repeat the word stakeholders over here, that to even if implement something innovative and on ground is just not possible in a country like India, with so many states and so many governments. So in a way, yes, your statement is correct, but then there are things happening on ground, and yes, I would be happy to share what we are doing and maybe other organizations as well.
Thank you, Binayak. And before I go to Effie, you made some, a statement about that, this is not, at all possible, and because of, the stakeholders and all. But that just takes me to one of my visits to Israel, which I was talking to Effie, and I went to the Air Force station. And outside that, there was a board which said, if you come to us with a difficult problem, we will solve it immediately. If you come to us with an impossible problem, we might take some time. So it's a mindset, and that's where Israel is, where they are. But totally take what you are saying, Binayak. It's no easy job, and an education system which has not changed for I don't know how many years, and embedded and into our DNA and into our social fabric. It is not something which will change overnight. I do probably understand that, but I think time has come now, and then we need to move very fast, otherwise we'll be left behind. So Effie, you have heard some comments from our Indian friends. What is the state of affairs of education in Israel, if you can just summarize and tell us what's happening there?
Actually, before you just referring to your previous comment, my partner and co-founder is a colonel in reserve in the Israeli Air Force. So that gives you the envelope of things. Like I said, over the past decade, we witnessed a revolution. We're actually proud of it. Employers shifted from searching personnel with certifications, quantifiable and well-defined skills, to searching for creative problem solvers, critical thinkers, and team workers. And those are the skills that everyone refers to as 21st century skills. Funny enough, we are 20 years into the 21st century, but we are still asking old questions, as you say. And we're asking students, children, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it doesn't make sense anymore. It used to be relevant many years ago, but today new jobs are created and adapted on a daily basis. And people can change their careers several times during their lifespans. So instead, we should be asking them, what problem do you want to solve, and what are the knowledge and skills that will help you get there? There's been, as you know, very little change in our education systems worldwide and also in Israel. And it's not about, it shouldn't be anymore about putting information in kids' heads anymore. They can find this information, that. It's about what they can do with it. And we need to shift from a model that served us well for many years and move to a new model where students are making and building while teachers, are coaches. Israel specifically, we are a little smaller than India, as you know, with 10 million people. The edtech industry is flourishing here. A lot of solutions, a lot of edtech startups and companies that are teaching anything from music and arts to math and physics. Nationally, I think that the Ministry of Education here in Israel is a little bit faster than the one in India, but not so much. We do see a promoting of STEM very strongly, but changes take time. That being said, schools have the autonomy and budgets to choose the materials they teach with according to the curriculum they've been given, and break the envelope a little bit, so they can choose whether it's printed or ebooks or software. So the change is actually coming from bottom up, from teachers and schools and students to the Ministry of Education, hopefully that will continue. Definitely what you said before, COVID changed the picture, and we hope to see this taking effect in the next years.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to pick up on a very important point which you made, Effie, which is that we are probably still asking the wrong question. After a few years, it's like 5% of those jobs don't even exist today. So what are you to plan for that when 60% of the 65% of the jobs don't exist? For example, today, if you look at today, one of the jobs is somebody who can drive a drone. How many people know that that's the kind of job which is going to. So I think absolutely fascinating and valid statement you make, that when you don't even know what jobs you are going to emerge, what are you asking and what are you preparing for? And that's why this concept of a lifelong learner and being totally open to learning and having skills which can help you pivot from one job to the other, I think becomes very relevant. And how all this becomes part of the new education structure will be important to see. So, well, that was a great start to the panel. I'm very happy that everybody gave their own candid, views on the statement. I think truth always is, or the reality, shall I say, is always between myth and the truth, right? So it's always like that. So there are some truths in that statement, and obviously there is a little bit of provocation as well. So with this, let's go more deeper, and I'll come back again to Dr. Bandyopadhyay. So the pandemic has obviously caused a massive shift to digital learning, and that too, as we said, over a 1 year period, like almost overnight. So while educational institutes have begun embracing technology to impart education during the pandemic, the question to you is that, do you think this trend will continue post the pandemic as well, especially in the context of higher education institutes and especially like IITs and the NIT? Or do you think some changes will revert to pre-pandemic world? What do you think will be the new world which emerges? Will it be a hybrid, or what do you think, Professor?
Yeah, so that's a very pertinent question, and I will give you my personal opinion first, like a personal experience first. So just like 99% of Indians, I am really slow to change. So at IIT Kanpur, some 7-8 years back, our Senate approved a new experiment with teaching, which they called the flip classroom model. Meaning you first deliver the lectures to the students in a online mode. It goes into an archive. Students listen to the lectures, and then they come back to the teacher for like the live interaction. In the classroom, live interaction is only discussion on the lecture. Okay, so instead of a monologue, the teaching becomes a discussion hour. And like a few of my colleagues actually started practicing it, and I did not. Now that the pandemic is here, we are forced to do exactly that, right? We are loading, recording our lectures. I now have created a YouTube channel for my own course, and students are listening to the recorded lectures, and then like the discussion hours is all about solving problems that they have, some doubts that they might have, and venturing a little bit beyond. So I now love it. My students love it. I love it. So that means that this is an ingredient that is here to stay. I'm pretty confident. I spoke with many colleagues. All of them are liking it because this allows us to take the teaching more towards learning than towards than just remaining limited to teaching. So that is one aspect that is certainly going to change. And the other aspect that I am confident will change is this very defined departmental boundaries that we have in our education system. That is likely to change dramatically. You will see that students are crediting all sorts of courses which fits their test, and you will see very different genre of students that will be graduating for our institutions. What will be critically important, though, is the market to respond appropriately. Just to bring it a little bit different aspect. As long as the jobs, any of you who have been in the West, you know that I know for a fact that the guy who used to fix my car, he used to earn more than some of my professors in the school. Okay. So as long as we have this very strong tier in terms of income, and education is the only easiest way to have a decent living, we will not achieve what we want to achieve. So we have to have, and I do not know how it will be done. Our population is a challenge. Okay, that it is, no matter how you cut it, eventually to grant opportunity to anybody will have to be through an insanely competitive process, and like, in other words, we have not been able to conceptualize scaling of education. I think that that's where everything falls apart. The moment we figure out how to scale quality education and how to value education and not the degree, then you will see things are going to change dramatically. But yes, to answer your question straight, I think that we will not come back to the pre-pandemic style or content. But we are very, very reluctant to change. So I will not say it will be a completely new paradigm, but the current status will hold supreme, maybe an 80-20 mixture of new paradigm versus the same old. And the other paradigm, the problem that has not been solved yet, and here we have all the tech geniuses conducting exams. You may have read in newspapers yesterday only that IIT Bombay had to cancel one. This online mode, maintaining the sanctity of an examination process, is so far not cracked as far as I know. I was talking to my friends in the US. Apparently, SAT is not being conducted this year because no one figured out how to conduct SAT in a manner that it reflects the performance of the student, and no cheating, etc., is involved. So that is one aspect that needs to be solved. Once that is solved, we might see hopefully more changes than otherwise.
Thank you for a very clear and a very concise, response. But before I go to the next panelist, I'd like to still ask you one question. That I ask you, what is the one thing in the pre-COVID environment which you would like to continue? What would that be, Professor?
That will be perhaps the personal touch, personal interaction with the students. In teaching, there is a whole lot more than just providing the content or giving the answers or clearing the doubts. It is also about knowing your students a little too well, responding to their emotions, understanding their personal problems. In the online mode, it is very apersonal, and that is something that I do not enjoy as a teacher. I do not enjoy that. So that I would like to continue.
Thank you. I was hoping that you would exactly say this, and you have. So thank you very much, Professor. So with that, I'll go to Anand. Anand, there has been a big surge in edtech startups investment, and I talked about some of the numbers as well. So from an investment perspective, do you think this is going to continue, or is it a bubble? Because for a long time before COVID, edtech was on the periphery, right? Always showing promise, but nobody was really making the investments and putting their money where their mouth is, which has changed over the last 10-12 months. But is it going to continue? And then which segments in edtech do you think will see the maximum growth? Is it the K-12, or is it going to be higher education, exam preparation, or continuous learning or any other thing. So what's your view on this?
First, a piece of context to this whole thing. You are right that in the last 12 months, a lot of money has been poured into the tech sector. However, this is there is asynchronous to this investment. A few companies have garnered a very vast majority of the total money that has come in. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. I won't take names, but a few of them, a handful of them actually have garnered 90% of the money that has come in. Now, the reason why I say that is because I'm putting two theses on the table today. Number one, and both I think everybody will agree to, because it's commonsensical stuff. Number one, that the change in education, the new normal that pandemic has created, is a new normal where the use of technology has been accelerated forward, and it's going to be there. It's not going to go back. And you started off with that. Things are not going to go back to what they were, number one. Number two, and again, Professor Amitabh referred to it, you referred to it as well. For us to really absorb the new normal and make education, and I spoke about learning truly into education that is driven by individual choice and individual learning, there has to be a lot of innovation. Huge amount of innovation has to come into education. Now, if these two things have to happen, there has to be funding that has to happen for a large number of companies. This is not the private equity funding that happens only at the top with the large companies, and that's also needed, that achieves scale. So there is scale-up funding, there is large-scale funding that is needed, there is scale-up funding that is needed for companies that are moved from startup to scale-up mode, there is startup funding that is needed, and there is seed funding that is required of the kind that Professor Amitabh and eCells and others provide, which is the bottom of the pyramid from an innovation perspective, where the actual hands-on innovation really happens. So to me, there is an innovation chain, and each of the bricks of this or the links of the innovation chain would require funding. And I think this has not been cracked as yet. I think you're right that if you take the overall numbers, EdTech has started attracting, but I think investors are extremely smart. They have understood this. There is a natural segregation of investors that is beginning to happen. Even within the portfolios, investors always segregate between Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and Horizon 3 returns. And they've now begun to realize investments have to be made at different levels. And by the way, Professor Amitabh, I'll send you a mail later about one of the companies, one of my investee companies, which may have cracked the assessment problem in a way which is very close to ideal. I will send the details to you later. But the point is, there is a lot of innovation that's happening. And those innovations require funding. And that funding will be risk capital. And I think at one level, many of the VCs perhaps have forgotten the venture part of venture capital. Venture, the word venture comes from adventure. So there is a certain risk involved there, and the risk part of it is forgotten. And I think probably what distinguishes Israel from India, one of the aspects, many, but one of the aspects, and I agree with what Eli said, if he said, which is a smaller country, it's perhaps a little easier in that perspective, but the veneration that's given to innovation in Israel is something that India can learn from. And funding should follow this level of veneration for innovation, working closely with education institutions, working closely with entrepreneurs who are willing to take a chance. And I think this continuum needs to be bridged, and I think that will happen. And therefore, there will be more funding coming in, number one. Number two, you asked me who's going to get the money. I think everybody's going to get it. And then rather than looking at it as K through 12, higher education, and so on and so forth, which is age-wise kind of split almost, if I can call it that, I think I would look at it slightly differently. Regulated education in India is a not-for-profit subject. Obviously, that's not going to get funding, but there is a whole bunch of others which are around it. Think of it as a circle around it with a lot of slices. Each of the slices represents different spokes of innovation that will have an engagement from bottom of the pyramid, economically speaking, of the kind that Binayak addresses, right through to a whole range of spokes of innovation. I think each of these spokes is going to have multiple players in it, and each of those players will be looking at solutions from different perspectives, and there will be funding coming in to not just help them get off the ground, become a true startup, but also for scaling up and then scaling beyond that space as well. I think that's going to happen. It's not a immediate term story. I mean, part of it is probably a dream in my head, but I really think it's going to happen over a 5-year period from now onwards, 2021 onwards till 2025. I think it's going to be potentially a golden period for edtech sector. Not in the sense of, I don't like this unicorn, statements that get made. I would like to define a unicorn in education as somebody that has made an impact for 100 million students. To me, that's a unicorn. Now, not based on revenues or valuation and so on and so forth, but based on the impact that's made. And when that happens, the transformation of thinking that education, while there is profit to be made, it's also a social activity which will make a difference to a single individual through learning. When that comes in, and that requires many, slices of innovation that I spoke about, I think there is going to be very vibrant money. Money is not a problem in India. There's a lot of money, but that money will flow in the right way, I believe. This is my dream anyway.
No, very good, Anand. I think you made many valid points, and I think the point about making impact to 100 million children and the social impact part of it, I am going to be raising that with Binayak as we go ahead. But VCs being smart people, yeah, they are smart people, but I hope this is not another herd mentality where everybody is going behind the same thing. And it is actually the things which you talked about. It is the adventure, it is the innovation which is taking the money, and not hopefully the herd mentality. That would be my own wish. But thank you very much again. Very good question. Effie, I'll come to you and probably ask you one of the most difficult questions, because this is really dividing India in two parts, this question, and it's like a fire going on. So there has been a huge debate about teaching coding to young children, with opinions ranging from it is never too early to pick up some coding skills. And there is a huge opposition to that, with people saying young children should be enjoying life and playtime rather than learning coding. So what is your take on this? And are there any parallels that you see in your own organization or in Israel?
Yeah, well, Avnish, as you probably know, the truth is between those two. But I'll address it, and before I address it, I want to provide the wider context for the wider view about computational thinking. Computational thinking is a set of problem-solving methods that involve expressing problems and the solutions in ways that a computer could also execute. And according to the International Society for Technology and Education, this systematic approach to solving problems is at the foundation of not just computer science, but many other subject areas and careers as well. And now, as for coding, over the past decades, coding has mistakenly become a synonym for computational thinking, because it was the easiest way to teach some of the methodologies of it. So I believe that the discussion about coding is limiting. And the real question should be if and when we need to expose children to computational thinking. And let me demonstrate it with questions that we ask 9 to 11-year-old children. So a rabbit and a turtle have to cross a river. It takes the rabbit 1 hour and 2 hours for the turtle. Question is, how long will it take them both to get to the other side? Now, we know they're crossing together, so the answer is 2 hours. Most children will answer 3. They know math in school, they learn how to add and multiply, but there is no math operation they can apply to solve this real-life problem. And it requires a different kind of thinking. And this is a good example where computational thinking comes in. Now, education systems, teachers, mentors, instructors need to find the right combination of tools, whether it's physical like Lego, or software, which is coding or other softwares, that will provide computational thinking skills for our children's future. In Israel, for example, there's a very interesting, we talked about the Ministry of Education earlier. There's a very interesting collaboration between the Ministry of Education and YATI, which is the Israeli Advanced Technologies Association. It's an association of all the high-tech companies in Israel. They both invest in promoting computational thinking, exact sciences, math, and coding outside of the national curriculum. So if the national curriculum does not require specifically to have computational thinking or coding, this has it takes it a little bit forward. So outside the curriculum itself, there's a yearly competition with all the schools in Israel. and they participate in games like ours and other platforms as well, and Microsoft Minecraft and CodeMonkey, to expose students to those kind of technologies and methodologies outside the curriculum or the regular hours of the day. And this is something that children in Israel do once a month every year. They enjoy it a lot, and you see that we get beautiful responses after this competition from teachers and from students without even having it in the curriculum. So it's nice to have it coming from the industry itself.
Well, I think I totally agree with you, and I think that's the difference. And this whole controversy, if it was not just about the way Indians describe coding, and it takes you to a higher level of as you talk about computational thinking, I think there will be less opposition to that concept. And what a beautiful way you have described it. But when you start talking about the coding and the way we understand it, and our small children are coding away rather than playing and learning life skills, that upsets a lot of people. And I think you have put it very, very, very well. So thanks for that, Effie. I think as far as I'm concerned, totally agree with you. And we should look for similar models in India as well. So Binayak, over to you now. Now, Think Zone has been working towards improving the education outcomes of children from under-resourced communities using what you call a tech plus touch model, right? And that's what Professor was talking about earlier as well. We all love touch, but we should not forget touch. We all love tech, but we should not forget touch from the old model. So what has been the impact of this pandemic on children that you have been working with, and how have you responded to the changes which have come along with this pandemic?
Thanks, Avnish. First of all, I would like to thank Anand for giving this major thing that as an educational organization, the first thing that should be required is impacting children instead of looking at unicorns and revenues. So since you made a provocative statement also in the earlier, so I would also like to say that there is like a wide gap, and and there is investments happening in India, and there is investments which is not happening in Bharat. So there is a big digital divide which is there in the country, and we have all known that. In fact, UNESCO as recently as 2020 mentioned that nearly 320 million children in India, they're not getting access to good education due to the pandemic. So at ThinkZone also we were using as you mentioned a tech plus touch model, wherein we had edtech in terms of mobile technology of helping educators to teach and engage children better. So when the closures like education like the closures happened due to pandemic, and all institutions got locked down, the first thing what we realized as an organization, because we had a physical mode of implementation as well, that there was no way we could reach out to children, right? We had enabling teacher-led model, but then what we realized sooner that simple mediums like WhatsApp or online teaching just won't work in the communities where we are working, and that is unfortunately the scene across India. So what we innovated, and it was in fact a new product which we sort of made in a war footing mode, and we started it in the first the pilots, and then slowly moved in adding advanced features to it from the second week of April, is that we sort of started with a low cost technology model which involves automated voice calls, SMS, and an IVR based solution. So we were looking at the population which does not have smartphone but has small features phone. So and the whole idea was that in what way we could engage children and parents in this regard, because children were staying and parents had to engage their children in making sure that their learning continues. So then the other thing that so this was the mode in which we are currently delivering our education program. That is one of the major products that we are doing, in fact, implementing it in Odisha. The second challenge, or the second thing what we realized was that most of the children are first generation learners. So it means that parents don't have, that technical expertise, we might say, to engage children, just like a teachers do in schools or, in learning centers. So we have devised, very simple do-it-yourself DIY activities based on very simple concepts of language and arithmetic, which anyone from any literacy level can implement. All they need to do is, just sit with their child, engage in 15 to 20 minutes of activities which are being shared with them to make sure that, children's learning, continues. So that was the major, the idea that we had. After implementing programs at the bottom of the pyramid, I have become a realist. So, my goals are pretty simple, even though that's one of the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge that we are facing is of an educational crisis. Children in class 5 are not able to study text and do addition of a class 2 level. That is what we are currently facing. So for us, we are not looking at, computational skills, higher order skills, but we have kept our targets very simple. How to make sure that children are developing foundational skills. That we have realized is that if the child by age 8 is able to, develop basic age appropriate skills in language and arithmetic, they're able to do something well once they, move to higher grades. So that is the first thing, Avnish, that we started or we innovated. In fact, we launched this product in April, and we already have, even though our, the scale that we are looking at is limited, because as Anand also had correctly pointed out, the investments which is happening is very cluttered, especially for investments made, again, I'll use the word India, but not in Bharat. So the investments, the edtech investment is not happening. And, say, for example, we raised money, say, a few years back, that is peanuts compared to what the investments is happening. And why it is the case? Because social enterprise people like investors, unfortunately, would think that won't make money. Right. So we have to look at innovation and think of innovation in such a way that it's sustainable. I have to, clarify that any business, any organization needs to be sustainable, but then for that, they need support initially. So for this, we piloted our on our own, and in fact, we didn't raise money to in fact launch this product. We did it on our own, because the first thing for organizations like us is that to make sure that the impact is happening on ground. So now, as we have started, scaling up, right now we are, getting quite a lot of good interest, to scale it up. And I'm hoping that this model with added features would be able to be replicated by other organizations, other you can say in other states also in a partnership mode.
Excellent, Binayak, and couldn't agree with you more on the statement you make about investments coming to India and not Bharat, and that's a very, very profound statement. Totally agree with you, and that has to change. I just see that we are only 5 minutes left, and so immersed in the discussion that probably we will end up asking just maybe one or two more questions. But let me ask a very quick question, if you gentlemen can give a quick response to. And this question is both to Anand and Effie, and Effie, maybe you can start. So, in this whole blitz scaling, shall I say, of edtech companies, I'm sure including yours, there is a concern that, there is a prioritization being given to growth over quality and inclusion. So, how is Plethora, for example, ensuring that you achieve your growth metrics without compromising on quality and inclusion? So, if you can give a quick response to that, and then Anand, I'd like you to add to it as well.
Yeah, that can probably take another hour to discuss, but it's a very good question. On our side, at least, we make sure we know that again the truth is in the middle, but on our side we make sure that the products we come up with are bulletproof on both how they look, how they perform. We hardly have any bugs, so we make sure that what we provide to students, let's not forget we're talking about 8 or 7 or 9-year-old students. We provide them with bulletproof products as much as we can, both on, again, the technical side, but not less important on the pedagogical side, because we have a team of computational thinking, computer science, education experts that write those lesson plans for the teachers so they can at point use them. We know that it comes if we provide something to the market faster. We can maybe do some, easy money very fast. But on the long run, we think that's not the right approach for us, at least.
Very good. And trust in Israeli to talk about bulletproof solutions. So Anand, what's your very quick view on this?
Very, very quickly, two things. Number one is, I think anybody who's in the education sector wants to be an entrepreneur first must understand the word accountability. They are accountable to impacting somebody's life, and that's serious business. It's not to be taken lightly, number one. Number two, I do not believe in the tyranny of the or. There is no or here. It's only and. You have to grow, and you have to grow highly accountable with high quality, and it can be done. It is possible to do an and I think you have to think and therefore you will do and. If you think or, you will get pressurized by investors, who I am not blaming investors, but pressure coming in from different directions, and therefore you will forget the other. So entrepreneurs will have to think and my own personal philosophy is do good, feel good, and then make good money, because money will come. But do good and feel good, I think that's critical, and do it at scale. And that and is what I will stress upon.
So growth and inclusion, growth, and accountability. And I totally agree that quality, and I totally agree that, you can do good by doing good. That's possible. And I think, that is something which somehow people don't understand, but, the whole concept of responsible business is a very important concept, which is slowly but surely catching up. So with that, very quickly to Professor, back to you. And, I know we don't have time, so very quick answer, because we discussed the new education policy. So what do you think about it? Is it creating more opportunities, or there will be limitations? Quick view from you on that.
It is all covered by the panel very well, that it means well. But the devil will be in the detail, in the implementation. And until and unless, innovation, which is the main thrust of the new education policy, I say this to my students and colleagues, innovation does not come from thin air. Okay, you have to be knowledgeable first before you can innovate to a new paradigm. And so unless and until there is a way of improving the quality of teachers and the content, no matter what policy you put in place, it will not. You will not see the effect of it. That's my realistic assessment of it.
So excellent point. I think, as you said, the devil is in the detail, and everything in the end, and like everything else and every other policy, it all depends on the execution and how we go about doing that. So thank you for that, Professor. And I know we are just about a minute left, so I'll come back to Binayak now. Binayak, if you had a wish list, and there are a lot of people here on the panel as well as in the audience, I'm sure, who are listening, and a lot of them are tech entrepreneurs. So what are some of the technology solutions which you think can make education more inclusive and empower children, the kind of children you are working with? So if you had a wish list, what kind of solutions would you like India to produce and our entrepreneurs to build?
The first, maybe the wish list was, widening the ambit of what we look at edtech. Like, what generally is edtech? The only thing that we look at advertisements, or maybe speaking about in news channels and in newspapers, is mobile technology, internet, online. So that is the first thing. Maybe if you ask me, like, the ambit of edtech needs to be sort of widened. And if that is widened, and if that is like an accepted practice, then we would definitely see money trickling into what I was talking about, Bharat. That was the first thing that I would wish to see. And the second thing, obviously, is to look at the under-resourced communities as a consumer and not as a beneficiary. That I would like to stress upon the fact that they are not beneficiaries. If they are end users, obviously, if they are not paying, someone else would pay for them. But then if we say that, like, they are beneficiaries, then the only thing that we would talk about is non-profits, NGOs. It's their work. So then that is again my wish list. If you ask me, is that, like, if we think in that line, the innovation would obviously happen a lot. and the innovation could be anything, and technology could be anything. It could be related to like for example, for our solution, we are trying to now devise machine learning to it, so that how could we identify voices to make sure that what is the feedback that we are getting from families. That is one example. But then if this is sort of not looked at as a charity thing, but as a sustainable business thing, or maybe as a consumer point of view, then we will see more people coming into this sector and trying to innovate. That is my thing.
Well, certainly from my point of view, I wish your wish comes true, because I think this is exactly the way we need to go. So I think we are at the end of the hour now, and I'd like to say thank you and todaraba to all my panelists, because I certainly enjoyed it and I learned a hell of a lot. It's not a segment which I know much about, but it was fascinating learning for me, and I hope our audience got a lot out of it as well. And it was really great to connect with all of you. I'm sure we will remain connected as we go ahead. But I think great insights have come in this very important session and on this very important topic of how EdTech is going to impact and create business opportunities. But we should make sure that, as I said, we should do good by doing good. And EdTech is very important, that it's not just for profit, because it has a huge impact across the society. So with that, I'd like to formally end this panel, and I'd like to just again wish everybody that they stay safe and healthy in these difficult times. And I'd like to hand back to Divya and Fiki. If Divya, are you there?
Thank you.
Yes, I'm here.
Great. So thank you very much.
So Avnish, thank you for being a fantastic host and moderator.
Thank you. We'll all be in touch. I'll certainly connect with all of you on LinkedIn and look forward for a great association. And thank you, Fiki, for giving the opportunity.
Yes, agree.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.